Welcome to week 1, part 3 of the Fantasy and Fae Bookcase Quilt Along by the Nerdy Quilter. That's me. Today we are going to go over the Crescent City book spines. So this wasn't a tutorial that I had originally planned, but several of you said that you guys wanted to see a little more breakdown for the specifically for piecing the moons. So I am going to try to answer some of those questions and go through my process for this particular block. So we already know the general outline for a pattern in this quilt along. We have the overall mirrored side or the paper side of the pattern, and then we also have the fabric side. So this is going to be the same orientation as your finished block, and this is going to be the orientation on the paper side of your block. We've already gone over how to cut out and tape together various individual sections. This block is pretty simple once you get the hang of piecing the moons. So this block, we only have three pieces. We have block A, which here's going to be the red moon, or the red book spine. Then we have block C, which is going to be the blue book spine. And then finally, we have block B, which in my original pattern I had, it was like a gray color, but I'm going to make mine green today, as well as the plain background strip there as well on B15. So for the B section, because that's going to be on the final edge of the block, so you've got A, C, and then B. In the pattern, this calls for section B15 to be solid background fabric. So that's just going to be one single piece of background fabric rather than another book. However, if you wanted to customize your quilt more or add a different book spine here to have a fourth book spine, let's say, all you'd have to do is, rather than use background fabric for B15, go ahead and use a wide strip of just fun fabric that you would want to use for a book spine, and you can kind of customize your pieces like that. You can also technically customize them by switching up the order if you wanted to. This one in particular doesn't have to be a specific way. You could have it be BAC, or you could have like CBA with some books apart. So you can really kind of customize whenever it's just straight book pieces. I tried to design most of them by having all parallel vertical lines, meaning this is a 90-degree angle to this plane. This is a 90-degree angle to this plane. So you can switch these books around without having to worry about getting the angles right or potentially messing up a seam allowance. That's, again, just a general rule for most of the book patterns that I have designed. I like to make them customizable, but you can also, it kind of helps that if you accidentally mix up an order, you can't really tell. It just looks like some sort of customized addition. So whenever I go to pick out fabrics for this block, I'm going to start by laying down my background fabric. So I always like to start with my background fabric, just so I know kind of what I'm working with, what starting point I have. I'm going to leave B15 as a solid background piece in my block, so I'm going to go ahead and put another piece of background there. My A section is going to be this purple batik. The C section is going to be this blue, and then I'm going to use green for the B as in boy section. For the crescent moons in this version of the block that I'm making, rather than using like a yellow color that the pattern calls for, I'm going to use a kind of polka dotted, multicolor, white confetti fabric that I have that I think will kind of bring all of the different colors together, but still look really good against the dark black background fabric. So if we start with section C as in Charlie, that's going to go ahead and be my blue block. First, we're going to lay out the fabrics. So I have maybe about a 1.5 to 2 inch wide strip of this white confetti fabric that I guarantee will be plenty wide enough for all of the individual crescent moon sections. I went ahead and cut probably 2 or 3 strips from that fabric, which might be too much, but I'll use it elsewhere for something smaller if I did cut too much. But if you cut a 2-inch wide strip, that's going to be plenty wide for all of your individual sections within the crescent moon here. Also have my background fabric. So once we have found our C1 and our C2 section, I'm going to want to make sure that I have a large enough piece of fabric for both of those individual sections. How I usually do it for these ones, since they're kind of a relatively small piece, I will just lay the C1 on top of my fabric strip. Probably going to have plenty of extra over here. I could use my light box like I did in the other book spine block, but for this one, I'm just going to kind of show you a shortcut where you don't have to use the light box if you don't want to or don't have one. So I'm going to give that blue fabric a rough trim. This is a good reminder that when cutting through paper like this, as you're paper piecing, your rotary blade wears out pretty quickly, so you'll kind of go through a decent number of rotary blades. Now I'm going to cut a piece of fabric that is going to be long enough for my C2 section. So all I need to do is to be 1/4 of an inch past this line and 1/4 of an inch past this line. So I'm gonna, again, err on the side of way too much and cut one about that size. And so once I have my pieces of fabric cut to roughly the right sizes, I am going to put a straight head or a flat head pin through my C1 and my book fabric, so the C1 paper and the C1 fabric. I'm actually going to go ahead and pull out the light box just to show you guys again the alignment. Doesn't hurt to double check. So we've got right side of the fabric facing down, paper facing up. So I'm going to put this directly in the center. If I was showing you the shortcuts, actually I'll go ahead and do that. So I was talking about some shortcuts in the week 2 video during the 4th wing badge video that, again, I'll have next week. So sometimes, rather than coming through and cutting 1/4 of an inch seam allowance between the C1 and the C2 line, right here, I'll go ahead and align my fabric such that there's already 1/4 of an inch right here. So I'm going to pin this in place, pin it parallel to the C2 line, and it'll already be 1/4 of an inch. Hopefully whenever I show it to you, that'll make sense. If what I just said is very confusing, go ahead and go back to your normal method of pinning it in the center, folding it, trimming to 1/4 of an inch, and moving on. I'm just showing you what I use to kind of speed up my piecing as I go. Pin C1. Verify that we do, in fact, have 1/4 of an inch overlap of that C2 line. We do. Everything looks good. So we're done with our light box for the C section. Now we're going to find our cardstock, and we're just going to verify that that C2 line is correct with the 1/4 inch of fabric that we left during the alignment period. Now you can use your ruler for this. You can freehand it, totally up to you. I usually just freehand it. Now, once we have C1 pinned in place, I want to attach it to the C2 fabric. So I'm going to pinch here along C2 and flip it over. And this is the fabric that I just trimmed at 1/4 of an inch. So I'm going to lay down my C2 fabric, right sides together, and that's going to be where my C2 goes. I'll throw a pin in here just to make sure nothing moves around. Now I'm going to turn this back over, and we are going to sew along the C2 line with about 1/4 of an inch lead in and another 1/4 of an inch lead out. So if we fold along this C2 line, so this is going to be where we sew on our sewing machine with a 1.0 to 1.2 stitch length. We have our 1/4 of an inch of blue fabric, and you can see the alignment's still there of the 1/4 of an inch of the white crescent moon or C2 fabric. And confirm that it's plenty long enough. So like even on here, if I used my mat as a guideline, it needs to be from this 1/2 inch up to this top inch, so that's like 1.5 inches, let's say. But my fabric down here is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 inches long. So plenty of fabric. So now I'm going to move on to the A section, and for my A fabric, I am going to have I'm going to have purple batik. Find the right side. It's always a little difficult to tell with batiks, or at least it is for me. So that's the right side. So I'm going to put right side down. And now I'm just going to make sure that the entire circumference of A1 is completely covered in fabric plus 1/4 inch. So what does that mean? So circumference, that's just the entire way around here. So all of these lines around A1 need to have at least 1/4 inch fabric around them, which obviously my markings there are way bigger than 1/4 inch, even without me measuring it. But this piece of fabric for the A1 is plenty large enough for the section on here. So I'm going to leave it as is. Now that I've put a pin in A1, we're done with our light box. We can take that away. We are going to get our cardstock, put our cardstock along the A2 line, and fold. You can then freehand or come in with your ruler and trim to 1/4 inch. So this is the line that we are going to sew. A few stitches before, a few stitches after. But that's the A2 line that we're going to sew. So if we fold it along here, this is the 1/4 inch seam allowance that we just made. This is the fabric that I want to use for C2. I'm going to flip it over, remembering that this is the side that I just trimmed, and put right sides together. Now, how do I make sure that this is aligned with the C2 section because I can't see the C2 section? Well, one, we confirmed that this A1 piece of purple fabric was definitely long enough for the C2 section, meaning C2 measured like, what did I say, 1.5 inches, I think, long, and this piece of fabric was 5 inches long. So I guarantee that even if I'm to the left or to the right or up or down, as long as I line up with this 1/4 inch seam allowance, I will absolutely hit the C2 section. If you still don't trust yourself, which I completely understand, my trick is to pinch the corner of the fabric, pinch the end of the fabric, and turn, but you want to keep your fingers kind of, so your fingers are in the exact same position, but just the only thing between them is fabric and paper, but they're in the same position. So if you flip it over, you'll see that I have plenty of room on either end of that A2 line. So this piece is going to be completely, totally fine exactly where it's at. I'm going to put a pin in then so it doesn't move. And then we'll move on to our B section. This is going to be my green book. Still have the same white colored fabric for the crescent moon. Whenever I was trimming my fabric, I didn't quite trim all of the selvage off of this particular one. So what I'm going to do is probably shimmy it over to the left. So like pretend that this fabric is behind the paper now, but I'm going to shimmy it over to the left so that whenever I go to trim the seam allowance for B15, I'm going to trim off all that selvage. So this is actually going to be up here. It'll be behind the paper, but I'm going to align it such that this selvage will get cut off. And we can confirm that all of our fabric is aligned by using our light box again. I'll lay down my B1 fabric. Going to put it right there. Add a pin so that it doesn't move. And I try to make it as parallel to the B2 line as I possibly can. So for B2, this is the line that we're going to fold on. We're going to cut a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I'm going to add our crescent moon B2 fabric, and then we're going to go to our sewing machine and sew along that red line. So again, we're done with the light box. I'm going to put my cardstock along the B2 line, fold, trim to a 1/4 inch seam allowance, grab my B2 fabric, flip, right sides together, just like that. I'm going to pinch and pinch, flip, plenty of fabric on either side, and then pin it one last time before I go over to the sewing machine. So I have now sewn down all of the number 2 lines for each of these sections. I have removed the flathead pins and iron open the seam, those 2 pieces. So here's the C section that we looked at earlier. You can see that I did roughly start where that red line starts and sewed all the way down here, right along that C2 line, and then ironed open the fabric. So now we have, this is our C1, and our C2 is going to be that white. So then we're going to go along and fold along the C3 line, trim it to 1/4 inch, add some more of our moon fabric, and continue along to C4, and then C5, and so on and so forth. Grab your cardstock and place it along the C3 line. Fold. You may have to push back the fabric with your fingers just a little bit to make that seam pop out of the fabric. You're going to trim to roughly 1/4 inch. I'm going to grab some fabric for your C3. So this is the line that we just trimmed. I'm going to flip it, right sides together, pinch the corner, pinch the corner. It's plenty big enough for C3. Flip back over and pin into place. So whenever you pin, make sure that you're not pinning along right where you're going to sew. I've broken several in needle doing that, or sometimes you have to remove the pin and then your fabric can move on you. So I pin it not as far away as possible, but plenty far enough away and typically parallel to the line that I'm going to sew, just to make sure that I don't hit it. So here's our A section. We sewed a 2 line on either side of it. We extended it. We ironed open that seam. And now we're going to go along. Now we're going to go on to A3. Take our cardstock, fold along the number 3 line, trim to 1/4 inch seam allowance, get crescent moon fabric, it's the right size. You could also hold up your fabric to the line here and see that it's going to have plenty of room on either side of that number A3 line. Fold it over. This is the one we just trimmed. Pinch, pinch, plenty of room. Attach with a pen. And so whenever we go to sew this A3 line, we're going to extend this way and extend this way. Moving right along to our B section, I ironed open the 1 to 2. Now I'm going to trim along the B3, fold. So here's a good example of how the fabric kind of grabbed to the paper. All you do is just take your fingers and just brush it down lightly, and those seams should pop out of the paper pretty easily. That's why you use such a short stitch length, because it should be easy to do that. Grab a piece of crescent moon fabric. It's going to go right here. I'm going to pinch, pinch. I'm going to scoot this up a little bit. Pinch, pinch. Now it's in the middle of that B3 section. I'll leave it there. And again, same thing, rinse and repeat. I'm going to go over to my machine and sew this B3 right along this line. I like to iron my fabrics flat before I start because it helps kind of remove any bumps and uneven terrain. This is a good example of that. Make sure that whenever I go to sew, if I sew this direction, that I flatten this out first. This can, 1, lead to very bulky seams, or 2, I could actually be short fabric if that gets tied in. So I could pin that open, I could iron that open, but I'm just going to make sure that I kind of press it with my fingers and make sure it's flat. So after sewing the C3 section. I ironed that open as well. I'm going to move on to the C4, and I'm going to do the C6 at the same time. This is an intermediate, I guess, way to attack patterns, a way to handle patterns. So I'm going to zoom in and kind of show you what I'm talking about. So I'm going to sew the C4 line next, right? So that's going to be over here and over here. I'm also going to save time by sewing C6 at the exact same time. So I'm going to go ahead and trim this 1/4 inch seam allowance, grab my C6 crescent moon fabric, and whenever I sew these on the machine, because these two lines don't cross each other or interact with each other at all, that means that I can sew them at the same time. So I'll sew the C4. I will sew C4. I will manually flip it up, and then I'll have a line over here that I've just trimmed to 1/4 inch for C6. I will grab C6 fabric, lay it down, sew 1/4 inch, and then come back and iron it open. If that seems too confusing for you, that's totally okay. Don't do it then. Keep on continuing exactly like we've talked about with C4. Then you'll do C5, 6, 7, 8, 9, all the way around. So if skipping numbers and trying to decide if different lines interact with each other confuses you, then don't do it. That's totally fine. I just do it because it saves me time. But if you make a mistake and you have to pick out a seam, that then completely gets rid of all of the time that you just saved. So I understand either way. Fold it along the C4, trim to 1/4 inch. That's the line we just sewed our 1/4 inch seam allowance on. I'm going to attach my C4 fabric with a pin. Flip this over. I'm also going to find C6 at the same time. Nope. Okay, so when you do this, that's right, when you do this, you can't pin your fabric first. So I trimmed my C4 line. Now I'm going to trim my C6 line. Okay, now I'll go back to my C4 line up here. Put my piece of fabric, pin it in place. Now I'll also take a piece of fabric for this C6 here. And after I sew this, I'll fold it up and I'll sew along C6. But again, if that confuses you, then don't worry about it. Now we're along to A4. So in this particular one, you'll notice that A4 intersects with A6 right here. So that means I can't sew them at the same time. So I'm going to have to sew A4 by itself. And then the next iteration, I can probably sew 5 and 6 at the same time. But again, just kind of keep that in mind that sometimes you can sew 2 at once and other times you cannot, but you're really looking for that intersection. So I'm going to trim A4, fold, 1/4 inch seam allowance, piece of moon fabric, line that I just trimmed along, and pin it in place. I'm also really liking this blue purple fabric that I chose. I think I'm gonna like this Crescent City block a lot better than the first one that I made. So here's C-section starting to come together. We're forming that crescent moon around the green. I'm going to find B4. Trim it to a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Get a piece of get a piece of moon fabric that's big enough, and it is. On the line that we just trimmed. So because this one's pretty long, I'm going to pinch and pinch. We're good to go. My fingers are well enough away. If I wanted to, I could shimmy it up this way a little bit more. Oops, shimmy it up this way a little bit more. Make sure it's lined up with that 1/4 inch seam allowance. Pinch, pinch, and now it's definitely centered around the B4. And I will add a pin so it doesn't move. So I wanted to show you the C section real quick. So I sewed C4, now I'm going to go sew C6. I'm just going to manually press this open, put my C6 fabric, pin that in place, and then come over here and sew along the C6 line. Back to our section C. If you have difficulty remembering exactly which pieces you've already sewed in here, I go through and I'll cross them out. So I've done 1, 2, 3, 4, and 6. So this next go around, I'll do 5 at the same time that I'm going to do 7 because they're far enough away from each other and they don't intersect or interact. Trim along the C5 line, push the fabric back, trim to 1/4 inch. So this is going to be back to my blue book fabric now. So I'm going to use blue for C5, and then I'm going to sew C7 at the same time. That's going to be my moon fabric again. Trim to 1/4 inch, and there's my fabric. So I will sew C7 on down here and C5 on right there. So we just did, make sure everything's flat, yep. So we did A1, A2, A3, A4. Now I'm going to do A6 and A5 at the same time. A6 is going to be my Crescent moon fabric, 1/4 inch, Crescent moon fabric, and then A5 is going to be my purple background fabric, purple book fabric. That'll be plenty big enough. So if I wanted to show how I was going to pin it, I'd probably do A6 first. So it's going to be right here. It's going to be this seam. Put that right there. And pin. Whenever I sew that A6 line, I'll manually fold this up over here, and then I will sew the A5. So we did 1, we did 3, we did 2, we did 4. Now we're going to do 5. It's going to be Crescent moon. And then right after 5, I'm going to do my last moon piece, which is going to be B10. But I'll just go ahead and cut that now, but I'm not going to sew it I'm not going to sew it on. I'm going to go to B5, B5, pin in place. For section C, we've done 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Now I'm going to do 8. Notice that I can't do 8 and 9 at the same time because they interact with each other. So I'm just going to do 8, which is going to be my blue book fabric. Fold. Trim 1/4 inch. And plenty big enough. That will go there. And back onto section A. We've done a 1, a 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I'm going to do 7 now, then 8. Notice that they intersect each other, so I can't do them at the same time. So 7 is going to be my purple. That was a really bad cut, so I'm going to use my ruler. Some people use an add a quarter ruler here, so that little ledge, little lip on the add a quarter, you can kind of grab the paper and make sure that you have a 1/4 inch seam every single time. I don't use that, but you could absolutely, if you had one, or if you have difficulties keeping that 1/4 inch seam allowance, purchase one and add one to your toolkit. I'm going to get one that's long enough. sure got right sides together, and I'll go sew that. We did B1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I'm going to do 10 and 6 at the same time. Trim to a 1/4 inch seam allowance along B10. I'm also going to do B6. Again, if this is confusing for you, then don't skip around like I am. I would recommend then just staying in order. Piece of back book fabric, it's green, and my last piece of moon fabric. So I will sew B10 and B6. Our blocks are really starting to look like moons. Only a couple more pieces left. For this C section, I just did C8, so now I'm going to do C9, which is going to be the blue fabric. Grab a cardstock, trim along, fold along C9, 1/4 inch. Then I'll sew like that. Here's our A section. I just sewed C7. So now A7. So now I'm going to sew A8. Fold along A8. Push the fabric down. Trim to a 1/4 inch. Some of these seams are going to start to get a little bulky, but they'll go back down shortly. What we're doing right now is just fully encompassing the moon here. So once we get these couple of seams, then we'll be done with the really bulky sections. I need my purple fabric. I'll do like that. And then we just sewed B10. I just said we sewed B10, but technically we're still on B6. So here's where it can start to get a little tricky if you aren't quite sure the exact order of things, then keep on sticking with the order that's recommended on here. But so I did B10, so I'm going to kind of cross that out of my mind. I did B6. Now I have to do B7. So B7 is going to be my next one. Zoom in here for that explanation one more time. So I just sewed B10 and B6 at the same time. So I don't want to move on to B11 because I still haven't sewn 7 and 8. So now I'm going to work on this B7 section, then 8, then I can go back to 11 if I want to. But if jumping around like that confuses you or you think you might miss a piece, then just continue doing them one at a time in numerical order. And that'll be my B7. And I'll go right there. Just so in C9, I'm now going to do C10 and C11 at the same time because they don't interact or touch each other. So both of those are going to be the blue book fabric. So I will fold along C10, trim to a 1/4 inch seam allowance, rotate, fold along C11, and trim to a 1/4 inch seam allowance again. So what I'm doing here is just holding it up against the C10 line to make sure I have enough in this direction. And then if I hold it up here, make sure I have enough in this direction. And I do. For my C11 down here, I'm in the same boat. Plenty up and down, plenty left and right. So I will then sew here, fold up, sew here, and fold up. If you have quite a bit of extra fabric hanging off past the paper, like on this one, you can just roughly trim it. I don't like to trim exactly to the seam allowance, which is this dotted line. I like to leave a little bit extra just in case my misalignment, or just in case my alignment messes up later on. It gives me a little bit more room for error. So I'm going to sew 9 and 10 at the same time. So those lines aren't going to intersect each other at all. They don't touch. So I'm perfectly capable of sewing those at the same time. For A10, I wanted to use this piece of fabric, and I could probably get away with it. It is technically wide enough, but that's still a little too close for comfort for me, especially since this is at an angle and it's not quite perfectly horizontal. So I'm actually going to cut a new strip from here. It's probably that wide, and I will use that fabric, which is just a little bit wider than my initial cut, but it's plenty wide for that A10 section. So I'm going to grab my cardstock, trim A10 to 1/4 of an inch, trim A9 to 1/4 of an inch. So you may be wondering how to handle the big section that is A9. So we've already determined that this is going to be A10's fabric, so I'll set that aside. What I like to do for these big pieces is I'll just grab a piece of fabric that is long enough in the left to right direction that it completely covers the A9 line. I don't quite worry about the up and down direction, because if I think this piece will be big enough by the time I align it, and it for sure would be if I did this direction. But I'm going to do this one for tutorial purposes, and if, say, after I iron it flat, there's still paper showing down here, I'll just add a new section. So I'll make this A12, and it'll still be purple book fabric, and by the time your whole quilt gets assembled, you won't be able to tell that there's one extra seam with matching fabric. It's a way to use up smaller pieces of fabric and then also just kind of not worry about alignment or weird angles quite as much. Just like with everything else, though, if that confuses you, then don't do it and stick with larger pieces of fabric. Moving on to our B section, we did 7, now I've got to do 8 and 11. I'm going to do those at the same time. Fold along 8, 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now this piece of fabric that I just cut off is going to be big enough to use for B8, so I'm going to keep that. I'm going to go to B11, fold, trim 1/4 inch, and use that piece of fabric there. Section C is coming along nicely. We have just finished 11 and 10, so now I'm going to move on to 13 and 12 at the same time. So I'm going to trim along the 13 line. I'm going to grab my ruler, since I do really need to change my rotary blade. I just haven't yet. It's A13. Now we're going to go to, C13. Now we're going to go to C12. Trim 1/4 of an inch. Both of those pieces, both C12 and 13, are going to be blue book fabric. So I'm going to use that one for up there, and I will use this piece for down here. So when I go to sew, also 13 on like this, fold it up, so 12 on like this, or if I sewed 12 first, but just because 12 is a bigger piece of fabric, I'm going to sew it after 13. Sorry if that's confusing. But here's 12, and then after I sew it, I'll fold it out, and we'll have a crescent moon. So our A section, we already have our crescent moon pretty much outlined. I'm gonna flip it over, and we were just barely big enough for this purple piece of fabric down here to cover the seam allowance just fine. So I'm going to roughly trim and roughly trim. So I'm gonna pretend that this piece wasn't long enough. So let's say my fabric stopped there, and I don't have enough of that purple fabric for this full A9 section. So rather than picking out the seam and getting a bigger piece of fabric or freaking out, it's very easy to solve this, very easy to fix this. All we're going to do is come down to the bottom of your A9 section where you can potentially, or you don't have enough fabric. Doesn't matter if this line is straight or wonky. All you're going to do is fold it, and now you're just going to pretend that this line that we just folded is a 12. It's going to be purple on purple, but it'll be a 12. So we're going to fold. I'm going to trim to a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and I will attach my A12 section down there, and no one will be able to tell. So we already sewed A10. I'm going to move on to A11, which is our true black background fabric. There we go. So when sewing these on, I'll sew it like that and like that. B section is also coming along nicely. We just sewed B12, so we're going to go on to B13 and 9 at the same time. So we did 8 as well. We got 9 and 13, and those will be our last two green book pieces of fabric. So for this B9 section down here, I only have strips of green fabric that are this wide, which is obviously not wide enough for that big green section. So I'm going to have to end up sewing some together like I showed on the purple book here just a second ago. But again, not a problem. No one will be able to tell. It'll be our little secret. And if anything, I think it brings more detail and definition to the books. So I'll probably use this one right there. So I have quite a bit of blue fabric kind of all over the place here, so I'm just going to give this a rough trim. Not trimming to the seam allowance, I'm just getting rid of this extra fabric so that it doesn't get in my way. Some pieces like this I will scrap, some pieces like this I'll toss. Bigger pieces like these I will keep in my scrap bin for future use on other projects. So the only other piece that we have for for section C is C14, which is a background strip at the top. So if I flip this over, because I only have this background fabric at the top, it should essentially look finished. It should look like a moon, and it does. Yay. So we will go sew right sides together, and that will be the last one for section C. Here's section A, where we sewed on A11 background fabric. Just doing a real quick trim to get rid of some of the extra. So here is piece A completely done. That looks like a moon, which is excellent. That's what we were going for. So now A is done. We will set that aside for now. Here is section B. We did B13 and the first part of B9. As you can see, B9 is definitely short for this individual piece, but that's not a problem. I'll show you a trick handy way. You'll also notice that the piece that I used for B9 is quite a long strip of fabric. Now I could trim it at the edge of this paper and I would guarantee that I'm not going to cut it too short, but I know that I have this really big B15 piece of background fabric. So what I'm actually going to do is pretend like I'm going to sew B15 and trim that to, I'm going to say, a generous 1/4 of an inch. It's more like a 1/2 inch, but that's okay. So I'm just got a lot of extra fabric over there, but now I can reuse this whole strip of fabric without cutting a new one. So for B9, I'm going to find roughly parallel to the end here. Now I notice that this is selvage, so I'm actually going to trim this to about 1/4 of an inch. I'm going to take my pencil, draw a line here. So this was B9, that was B14, make this B15, and now this will be B16. Hopefully that makes sense. If it doesn't, I would recommend just getting a big enough piece of fabric so that you don't have to worry about that at all. I'm actually probably going to have to sew on a 3rd strip just because I don't want to cut more green fabric from my my yardage cut. I'll use a couple of these smaller ones, but it'll be fine. And then I'm going to trim along the B14 line, which is our background fabric. We're going to take another close look at section C here. So this is what happens whenever you skip around sometimes and don't pay close enough attention. So I noticed that my moon here, I was supposed to be sewing B14, which was the background, which means that my moon should be completely done. But I noticed it had a weird little cap on it, which means I probably missed a section. So I went back and looked at my paper side, and I did, in fact, completely miss B12. That's what happens when you skip around, is sometimes you overlook things. Luckily, this one's a super easy fix. I will do this for some of my patterns sometimes, but I'll also do this for other patterns. If there's a different order that you want to sew it in, you can just extend the line oftentimes. So I'm going just to extend the B12 line here. So use my colored pencils. So this is the line that I'm now gonna fold and trim against, as well as sew on my machine. So B13 is still here connecting, but I'm going to trim off the rest of this, extend the line so I encapsulate all of my seam ends, and then I'll go to C, so B14. So sorry for the confusion. Hopefully you don't mess up with that. Again, if you're sewing in order, you shouldn't, but sometimes mistakes happen. So you notice that my paper is now really, really perforated. Again, I'm using some recycled paper. It's a little thinner than normal copy paper, which I really like. Unless you make mistakes, then it can be kind of a pain. But I'm just going to take some Scotch tape and put that over it. And go back to the B12 line, fold, 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. And I'm now going to attach the new extended B12. So section C is now done. Got a good crescent moon there. I'm going to trim off some of the excess fabric. Section C. I'm going to set that aside while I finish up section B. Well, this now looks a lot more like the crescent moon that I wanted it to look like. So you'll see this is the original 13 section. All they did was sew 12 all the way across it. Now I'm going to sew a B14, which is going to be my background fabric. Now you notice that I added a second strip down here that is still not long enough, which is fine. Again, I planned for that, because I wanted to use up the strip of fabric that I have rather than cutting a new one. So I'm going to give it a generous quarter of allowance over here into the background. I'm going to find a line that is roughly parallel, trim to 1/4 of an inch, and draw. That'll be B16, B17. Also B16 down there. And now trim B14 to 1/4 of an inch, and use the same background fabric that I had cut just a second ago. So I finally have the book part of section B done. Do a couple of rough trims. Get rid of some of the excess, make it easier to work with. Now I'm going to deviate from this block a little bit. So sorry in advance for the super beginners if this is confusing. I don't just want to have this entire piece be a very large section of background. Again, I could do that. The first crescent moons for my very first quilt, I kept it exactly like the pattern says to, but now that I'm kind of thinking on a new quilt, I just finished a 4th wing block, which is here, and I want to pay tribute to some of the characters in 4th wing, so I'm actually going to add in a lightning bolt book here next to this Crescent City one, and then have background next to it. Or I might just add a solid, book. What do we, okay, let me lay them out. Seems like a good idea, doesn't it? So we'll do A, C, B. So I was trying to decide if I want to do the full space that the background is supposed to be in lightning fabric, or if I wanted to do like a skinny one and then add background fabric. I think I'm going to go ahead and leave it the entire block, so I can see the actual lightning bolt design. If I wanted to do 2 pieces, all I would have done is take my cardstock and pick some distance in between here at B15 and draw a parallel line to these over here. So if I split this in half, now I have 2 books. I could do a book here and background here. I could do background here and a book here. Kind of totally customizable, up to you. This would be roughly how thick it would end up. Honestly, no, I'm going to do 2. I changed my mind. Shocker. I'm going to do 2. I'm going to make this a little bit wider, though. Yep, just a little bit wider. Like that. So I will cut my lightning fabric. I want it to go like this. So that'll be more than enough background fabric for that book, but I just want to make sure I have enough to kind of move it around and trim it as I see fit to get some of the bolts into place. So we added 15, 16, we're really adding numbers here. This is going to be B17, and it's going to be lightning now, and then this will be B18, and that'll be background. So I'm going to go iron this flat to make it real easy to attach to B17. Before I do that, I'm going to go ahead and trim my new book. This is where the 24-inch ruler really comes in handy, to make sure you have enough straight edge on either side that you can just you can just cut that to a 1/4 inch seam allowance really quick. So then I will go over, I'll flip it, I will attach my lightning fabric down here. I'll sew along this line, extending it on one side and extending it on the other, and then I will come back and show you how I finish it off with that background piece of fabric. So I hadn't decided which side of the lightning fabric I was going to use. Turns out I'm going to start on this side, so I want to make that a straight line, just to reduce some of the bulk in the seam allowance. So my new lightning book is now in place for B17. I will trim my B18 line. I'm going to go ahead and make this just background fabric. You could also make the lightning book the entire width of that section, or you could add in a different color, like say you wanted to have like a pink fabric or something, you could put that there too. Make sure this is long enough, cut it to size, and I'm going to go sew along the B18 line. And there's the B section with the new lightning book added in. So here's the original pattern. You can see I've got red, blue, green, and then that big black background fabric. Now I'm going to have purple, blue, green, lightning, and then background fabric. So my sew order is still going to be the same, A plus C plus B. This is where the overall paper pattern comes in handy for me. So I'm going to match the paper side of my pieces to the orientation of the paper side overall. So B is going to go on the left, C is going to stay in the middle, and A is going to go on to the right. If I look at my sew order, I'm going to sew A to C. So the seam that I'm going to sew is this guy right here, all the way down. A to C, which, if we look at these guys, that is this. Only got not use blue. So I'm going to sew down the solid line between the A section and the C section. Now first I will trim to exactly a 1/4 inch seam allowance, which should line up directly with this dotted line. That way, whenever I put them right sides together, I guarantee it will be a perfect 1/4 inch seam allowance. They'll line up and everything will be good to go. So I like my 24-inch ruler for this. Put it right along the solid black sew line, and then trim along the dotted seam allowance. Repeat for section C. And to ensure alignment up and down, we're going to identify a corner where these two combine, meaning this is a connecting corner and this is a connecting corner. Or I could use these two down here. Totally up to you as to which ones. I'm going to use the ones up there. Now I'm going to take my pin and stab it through the corner of the A block, push it all the way through. I'm going to pick up my C block, go right sides together. Right, so once this seam is sewn, it'll look like this. And I'm going to do my best to stick it through the fabric side, but nail the center of that corner, like the edge of that corner. That's pretty close. So that's really what I'm shooting for. Now I'm going to align the 1/4 inch seam allowance that I just cut to make sure that it was a 1/4 inch. I'll grab a couple of clips to hold everything in place. I can remove this pin so I don't stab myself now, and I will go sew along this solid line, extending above it and extending below it. Now, whenever you're sewing these two sections together, it doesn't matter which side is facing up. You could have A facing up or C facing up. As long as your alignment is correct, that black solid line should be the same on both sides. So once you have those sewn together, you can flip it open and see we are starting to look like real books. I don't remove the paper from the actual body of the block until the very, very end, right when I'm getting ready to combine all of my blocks into a finished quilt. However, when I'm combining sections like this, I will remove the paper from the seam allowance. That is because whenever I iron it, I usually iron the seam over like this, and I don't want to get paper trapped behind that seam to either make it more bulky or to hide it and not make it easy to remove before I go to sandwich everything and wash it. Tweezers are also really handy here to grab any troublesome pieces of paper that can get stuck in some of the small spots. So I'm going to go iron this open real quick. And then we have B. So if we're matching it off of the paper side, I need B to be on the far left and AC to be on the right. So these are now seam allowances that I'm going to trim and the solid black line that I'm going to sew on. So once you have those trimmed up, now we're going to align with our pin again. We're going to pick these two corners up here, stick our pin through the corner of section C, right sides together, and then poke it through, poke it through the matching side of the B corner. Align our 1/4 inch seam allowance that we just cut. Hold in place with a pin, or with a clip, excuse me. Make sure you don't get it all cockeyed. Make sure you don't get it skewed. I want that to align as perfectly as possible. It should be pretty easy. The paper makes it a little more sturdy and a little easier to push around. But just make sure, because if your seams are off here, it can really affect the way that your finished block looks. We've now sewn along those black solid lines. We're going to remove the paper in between the seam allowances. And again, this is why we use such a small stitch length, is to make this paper very easy to pull out. If you use a larger stitch length, you risk the chance of pulling out the actual thread and breaking it. No. So here is our finished Crescent Moon, Crescent City book spine blocks. I added in my own little lightning block here. If you flip it over to the paper side, we can see all of the different sections that we've sewn together, like one big puzzle. I'm going to do one last trim of it, and I'm not going to go to the dotted seam allowance yet. I will trim all of my blocks to 10.5 squares right before I go to assemble everything. I think that storing them with the paper on in rough cuts reduces the amount of fraying that can happen with an individual block with the amount of times I'm handling it. So there we go. So I promised that next week we'll get to a little more fun blocks, although I think the Crescent City one was pretty fun. Here is the glass castle that we'll do. I did these in blues to look like, reflecting glass, blue. I think this would also be really cool in green though, kind of like Wizard of Oz, Emerald City, or you could do, like if you had a light background, if you did a black castle, it could look like Morath. Totally up to you, customize it the way you want. But next week we'll be going through the glass castle. So each individual section for this is fairly simple. It's only a couple of pieces, but there are more sections in this one than any pattern that we've done so far. But I think with the skills that we've learned through week 1 and the detailed videos of week 2, even if you're brand new to paper piecing, you should be able to make them no problem. So also next week, we'll have our 4th wing block. I chose some pretty vibrant colors for mine, but the 4th wing is only going to be 4 different sections. We got A, B, C, and D. So this one had 3 sections. The Crescent City Moons had 3 sections. This will have 4 sections. A little more detail within the individual wings here, but still not too bad. Not as small a pieces as on the moons. Then we'll move on to more sections, but they're relatively simple for the glass castle. Then eventually we'll move on to some of our fire hearts and our word marks, our Illyrian bat wings, and then one of my favorites is Lahaba, the fire sprite. So all of those are coming. Stay tuned. Leave me a comment below if there is a process that you want to see more of or want to see less of. These are my first couple of YouTube videos trying to make a guide on how to paper piece, trying to make it a little less intimidating for those who haven't done it before. So if there's anything missing, let me know. I would love to add it in. Comment below, like my page, follow my page. Excellent. We'll see you next week. Thank you.